Chapter 24. Tuesday late afternoon. Back at home, Doreen filed away the papers Nan had asked her to keep, all in a separate folder with notes from today and such as Nan requested. Then Doreen ran these pages through the scanner, and also copied the stack Nan had asked her to do. Finally, she renamed the digital file and emailed one to herself and one to Nan. With that done, she placed the copies she had to return to Nan on the table and filed hers away. She was getting good at this. But she also needed a system for all this note-taking. She opened up a Word document on her laptop and typed some notes on Steve's case. Once that was done, she researched the Hartley family tree. The summary from the journalist on Steve's information had been a huge help to her, so Doreen wanted to continue with a summary of her own, writing down the information Nan had gleaned from Dick re this new name, the Hartleys. But that was a little more confusing. Still, Doreen did the best she could from her chicken scratch notes. Didn't Nan say the husband had been murdered first, then burned in the house fire? For that, she needed Mac. She dialed his number, and when he answered, his voice was distracted. "Hey," she said. "Have you got a moment to talk, or are you busy?" He gave her an exasperated sigh. "I work full-time, you know." She winced. "So does that mean yes or no?" "I've got a moment," he said. "Sorry. I just came out of a meeting. That always makes me frustrated." "I can imagine," Doreen said, commiserating. "Meetings are more about people sitting around in a circle, avoiding the work they really have to do at their desk." At that, Mac let out a bark of laughter. "For somebody who never worked a corporate or government job in her life, you seem to have a good idea of how meetings go." "You can blame my ex for that," she said bluntly. "He used to always complain about the fact that meetings were useless, and nobody ever did anything they were supposed to do." Mac was still chuckling when he asked, "So what's the problem?" "The arson cases. There's a fifth one, but I don't have a file on that one yet. I just heard in a roundabout way from Hattie Hartley that her husband Claude was dead before the fire. Did your records show that?" "I haven't had a chance to pull those cases yet," he said. "I thought you were leaving those alone." Dick at the retirement home had a niece who was related to Hattie in some way, Doreen said, confused how that worked herself. But Dick said Hattie got a payout to keep quiet. Remember how we were trying to figure out why the women would have been given a check? It wasn't out of the goodness of Steve's heart. It was to keep quiet. Because the husband had been murdered first, and then the fire was used to cover up the murder. But forensics should have shown if he was killed first. Maybe, but what if it's a soft tissue wound? Usually, if there's a body, they go through the remains of the fire very carefully, he said. The autopsy would show if he was alive before he died from the fire. Sure. But let's think about this. If he's shot in his bed on the second floor and then the fire ravages the house, so basically nothing is left, just a few bones. That bullet would have either gone through the body, or would have been burned in the fire. The body wouldn't even be on the second floor anymore, depending on how fierce a fire it was, so the bullet is somewhere in the remains of the carcass of the burned house. Are you really telling me they'll find it? I would hope so, yes. Huh, she said in confusion, thinking about finding a bullet in the ashes. Well, could you check the records to see if this is new information or that maybe you guys already knew Claude was murdered first? Besides, for a fire to burn that hot, you need an accelerant. She noted how he had sidestepped her question. Of course, she said. Hence, you guys already know it was an arson case? Silence. She smirked. I'd love to hear back on this when you get a moment, she said and hung up. It was already late in the day, and she hadn't done any gardening because she'd been so busy doing paperwork, but that was no excuse. Before she ate, she was determined to get something done outside. She hopped to her feet, and instead of her usual tea, she grabbed a bottle and filled it with cold water. Then she grabbed her gardening gloves and opened the back door, letting everybody out into the yard with her. "Let's go get some physical work done," she said. She'd already done work on the echinacea bed, so she chose the next bed to work on. As she looked toward the house, she was determined to work on a couple feet of her garden every day. With that thought in mind, she stabbed her shovel into the ground to mark what she should get done today, and started pulling weeds. 1 hour later, she hit her mark. She crowed in delight. "It's not that bad after all," she said to Goliath. He was lying on his back, his 4 legs in the air, snoring. She laughed, pulled her phone from her pocket, and took a picture. Then she sent it to Mac and Nan. She captioned it "a hard day's work," then put away her phone. After that, she kept on working for another hour, determined to get a little more done. By the time she got another section done, she realized she hadn't expected near enough from herself. She could do a lot more out here. Within a month, she could have this whipped into shape, and at least know what the devil was planted here. But it was enough for today. She stepped onto the deck, wiping the sweat off her brow, and looked with pride at the 6 feet of garden she'd cleaned up. "That looks good," Max said from behind her. She let out a shriek and turned around, glaring at him, her shovel already in defense mode. He took a step back, his hands up, but his grin said he wasn't sorry at all. She still glared at him. "I have been attacked too many times in my own home and in my own yard. A little warning would be nice." "A little warning, definitely," he said. He crouched to hug Muggs, who gave him a great big welcome. Even Goliath walked over and flicked his tail at him, looking for some cuddles. Thaddeus, on the other hand, was still perched on a branch of one of the maple trees nearby. He looked at Mac. "Thaddeus is here. Thaddeus is here." Mac chuckled and walked over to give him a hug. Well, it was more like a stroke on his breast. Thaddeus hopped on Mac's shoulder. "He doesn't really wait for an invitation, does he?" Mac asked. "No," Doreen said cheerfully. "He does what he wants, just like the rest of them." "Well, that's fair," he said. "Seeing as how you do too." She glared at him again, and he cracked a smile. Then he said, "There was no evidence that the Hartley man killed in the fire was murdered." She gasped and her face lit up. "Perfect. So that's new information." "It's a new supposition," Mac corrected. "Remember that thing called evidence? If you didn't find a bullet, they killed him in another way. And, like you said, an accelerant was used, so the fire would have burned hotter than normal." Then she paused before saying, "What I want to know is where were the women at the time of each of these arsons?" I checked, and apparently, Hattie was out for several hours that evening with girlfriends, and her alibi checked out. "I wonder if she knew the money was coming," Doreen said, a cynical tone to her voice. "If that was the case, that would make it premeditated," Max said. "She's dead now, so there's not a whole lot you can do about her. But we need to find out if the other arson cases are similar. The other 3, which were the opposing gang fires, I did check. And yes, all 3 men were burned in the fires with no evidence they were killed beforehand. There had to be a reason why they didn't get out of the house fire," she said. "And don't tell me in all cases the women weren't home." Mac shoved his hands in his pockets and glared at her. "Yes, that's correct. But their alibis were very different. One wasn't even in town visiting her mother in Vernon, and the second one had a wedding to go to, and the other one was in Vancouver for the weekend." "Oh, how very convenient," Doreen said sarcastically. "Yes, there are notes to that effect in the file, but the fact remains that their alibis check out and that no evidence was found to link them to the deaths of their husbands." "Of course not. The wives were told to get out of town and to stay away. Rather than be home and die with their men, the women took off. That's love for you." He shook his head. "You've got to work on that attitude." She wrinkled her nose. "Sorry, it's still a hangover from my ex-husband." With good reason, Mac admitted, but you can't let it completely destroy your attitude. No, it won't. Eventually, she said. So, how do we find out if these men were dead first? Well, there were no lungs to check to see if any smoke was inhaled, he said. Their bodies were pretty well incinerated, and that was done deliberately on the part of the arsonist. Sure. So we'll assume they were murdered. Otherwise, why go to those lengths? And again, no forensics. No, but the link is Steve. Mac crossed his arms. Just because he handed over a check. But did the check come from his own bank account? And if it did, was there a corresponding deposit to his bank account from the Devil Riders? Either someone gave him the money to hand out, or someone reimbursed him for that payout money. I might take a look at that. Mac studied her for a long moment. I still need a legal standing to get into his financials. It's there. We just have to keep digging. And I know you weren't on these cases originally, so are the original investigating officers still around to talk to? The journalist made it very clear those payouts were for something, and that Steve was behind it all. Too bad the journalist didn't come up with any proof he could bring to us, so we could have done something about it then or now. I know, she said. He's still alive though. Not in very good shape. He's on his last few breaths apparently in a hospice. But Nan thought she might stop by and see him. I could also drop by if there was a potential legal reason, but I don't want to upset a dying man. Agreed. So we have to do more research on Steve. The cops have been looking at Steve for a while, Mac said. But again, we're lacking evidence and real viable reasons to go any further into his life. I don't like the legal system sometimes, Doreen announced. Mac laughed. Most cops don't either, but we're sworn to operate within the law. And that means there are limits to what we can do. He entered my house illegally. Why don't you do something about that? Can you prove it was Steve? You know attorneys. They'll twist your words inside out and backward and say it could have been anybody and not him at all. I know, Doreen said morosely. Then she was quiet as she thought about her options. What are you thinking about? He asked suspiciously. She beamed. I was thinking of a trap. Mac shook his head. No, that won't work. Steve's been operating like this for a long time. Sure, but that doesn't mean his gang will like it. To hear that the file was unearthed. What if I just happen to let people know this file is full of all kinds of incriminating evidence and names? Which is why Steve stole the folder in the first place, he reminded her. To ensure that information doesn't get out. But people don't know that, do they? And they certainly don't know if there are more files that he didn't steal. You're asking to have your house burned down around your ears, he warned. Have you forgotten that's the way these gang people get rid of problems? That stopped her. She stood here for a moment, arms crossed over her chest. Well, we have to do something. This is hardly acceptable. Agreed. Let me think about it, okay? And I want to read up on the arson files. Did you get anywhere on any of the other harmless stuff? Like the woman who had the hope chest? Doreen shook her head. Not yet. Nan doesn't know anything about the boxes found in the attic, and I just photocopied some paperwork for her on her house and stuff. And I completely forgot to look at the deed of trust on the house to see who Nan bought this house from. I'll do that when I go back inside. Good, he said. Remember. Focus on that first. I will. But I'll hardly forget the Bob Small stuff either. At that, Max spun on his heels and glared at her. She raised both hands in frustration. I know serial killers are dangerous. But honestly, I think Steve is one of the most dangerous. He operates in the shadows like a snake. And he lets people get away with all kinds of shit. It shouldn't be allowed. And we're on it, Mac reminded her. Yes, she said, grinning. We're on it.